Dude. Not only did we learn more in One Piece chapter 1033 about Zoro's upbringing, but did Zoro just use Supreme King Haki? That's wow. Because everybody started foaming at the mouth, and that's the same thing we saw with Luffy when Luffy used it. Wow. That makes sense, though. It makes sense that Luffy's second in command would have Supreme King Haki as well. That's wow. I am stunned because I was getting so into Zoro's backstory and learning more about the former samurai who was there and learning more about the whole thing with the swords that when that panel happened, it just took me out. Like I was sitting there cussing the whole time. I was like, what the fuck is going on here? Oh man, let me back things up a little bit, man. Yo, this chapter, Jesus Christ. Yo, when I tell you I'm grinning from ear to ear, it's moments like this that make me wish that I was back on camera again. Cause like, dude, I'm telling you, man, I am cheesing while I'm talking. So backing things up, the chapter opens up where you have Zoro, he's fighting against King, and King is watching as Zoro is basically shouting at the Enma sword saying, who gave you permission to unleash all this power? And King makes a snarky remark after the fact about, I've never seen a swordsman undone by his own sword. And that's because King takes the opportunity to charge forward at Zoro. Zoro takes his sword and he lands an attack on King. And you see this giant explosion. And it's then that we find out as Sanji's fighting against Queen, Queen's like, yo, he's never gonna win against King, and it's because he comes from a race that was known as gods. They're capable of surviving in any type of a natural environment. And when Sanji asks, well, if they're so powerful, how is it that so many of them died? And Queen ends up throwing one of those huge energy blast back over at Sanji, telling him to go check a history book. So that right there, that's kind of a sign that like the world government probably had something to do with that. However, we find out when it shifts over to Zoro that Zoro was able to avoid being killed because he was able to use armament haki. And Zoro's like, I can't believe he's still alive. This guy blew himself up. I'm not understanding what's going on here. Zoro tries to land another attack, an even more powerful attack than what he used before. However, this just gets brushed off by King as well. King ends up shooting one of those stakes out at him. Zoro ends up getting pierced from the side. Zoro's coughing up blood. Zoro begins to start flying off the island, and Zoro is reaching out for his sword. And that's when King makes that snarky remark, I've never seen a swordsman held back by his own sword. However, that's where we start getting some of the flashback, where Zoro learns about one of his swords, and we get another flashback where Zoro's told that like, hey, this sword is bewitched, and one of the men tells him like, hey, like I can't give you this sword because if I give it to you, that'd be just as good as me actually getting you killed. King ends up throwing the snarky remark of like, hey, you're gonna die just to try and save your sword. You can tell King doesn't fully understand it. However, that's where we learn more about it, because Zoro is going after the sword that belonged to Kuina, and we get that beautiful moment where Zoro, he's looking at the photo of Kuina at her funeral, and he's also holding the sword saying that he's going to be sure to make sure that both their dreams will become true. He's going to hold that promise to become the greatest swordsman. And you get another flashback where Zoro is in Wano with one of the swords, and Zoro's beginning to put all the pieces together. He's like, okay, wait a second. So why was a sword like this that came from Wano in some rinky-dink village in the East Blue? And so you have a brief moment where Zoro, he's fighting against King, but the way that these flashbacks are shown and weaved into the battle, it lets you know that Zoro, he's there, but he's not quite there yet. He's just operating off of pure instinct. And so Zoro thinks back to his training that he had where he was teaching Momo how to use a sword, and Zoro begins to start thinking about the old man that he found out was actually Kuina's grandfather. And so that's interesting right there, because what we're finding out right here is that the connection that Zoro had to Wano, it wasn't a direct connection for Zoro himself. It was a connection that came more so from that connection with Kuina. And we find out that Zoro was being watched as he was training. The old man of the village was keeping an eye on Zoro when he was there. He saw him training. He gives Zoro his swords, and he gives some information that makes a lot of sense of how Zoro views a lot of things now, because he first tells him like, I'll give you these swords, but this thing you need to understand, a sword's a lot like a kitchen knife. Only difference is this sword is meant for murder. A kitchen knife will cut people. A sword will kill somebody. And the better the swordsman, the better the sword is at actually killing. And the thing you got to keep in mind is that swords all have their own personality. And so when you hear people say that a sword is cursed, it's because they weren't able to bend that sword to their own individual will. And so he gets the responsibility talk. It's kind of the same talk that you get when, like for me, I grew up in a household where there was a gun in the house, and I learned very early on that, like, hey, you don't play with guns. This can be used to kill somebody. It can be used to kill you. Treat it with respect. It's the same type of talk that Zoro's getting right here. And when Zoro begins putting all those pieces together, he looks over at the Enma sword, and Zoro's like, wait a second, like, this is why my village was named the way it was. This is why that old man in the village didn't want anybody to know that he was a samurai, because he said the world government was going to come after them if they knew it, because now we know why, because everything going on with Wano. And Zoro puts the pieces together and says, the sword chose me and the sword is currently testing me. And so he grabs the sword and he reflects on the fact that, like, wait a second, like, Odin was able to wield this sword like it's nothing, but how can I wield this sword and stabilize my haki if I have to keep using this level of energy to try and keep fighting? And when all the other men are saying, like, hey, we're gonna take out Zoro, we're all gonna get promotions, they all start foaming at the mouth and they end up falling over. And that's when you have King say, okay, so you're trying to be a king as well. And Zoro recalls the fact that Luffy said, like, hey, I'm going to be the king of the pirates. And if I'm going to be the king of the pirates, I'm going to need the greatest swordsman. And so that's basically Zoro coming full circle right here. And I like this because this feels like we're getting into that final stretch for Zoro as a character, man. I like this right here because the power up that's coming for Zoro, it's going to feel earned because we just saw all the steps and hurdles it took for him to get to this moment. And I thought it was a wise decision in the panel, in the chapter off with the panel where Zoro says, I got to keep my promise to my captain and my best friend. And that kind of puts the nail in the whole thing, because I thought for a second, I was like, man, you know, like with the Straw Hats, all of them to an extent have kind of bucked Luffy to an extent where they moved off. Like with Chopper, Chopper resisted, but he wasn't in the crew. All of them kind of, you know, been at odds with Luffy. And for a moment, it looked like Oda was setting that up with Zoro and Luffy, where you had the stuff at Punk Hazard, where Zoro's like, yo, you need to grow the fuck up for a second. With this right here, Zoro's come full circle. And in order to achieve the dream that he has, he also needs to follow in Luffy's footsteps. So I thought this was good, man. Like, this was a very, very good chapter. The Supreme King Haki, that definitely caught my attention more than anything else. But I'm curious to know you guys' thoughts on this. Where does this reveal rank for you? Was this something that you were actually expecting? And then the second question I have for you guys is, how do you guys feel about the fact that Zoro potentially has Supreme King Haki? But as always, guys, if you like anything I had to say, don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and share. Thank you so much for watching to the end. Have an awesome day, guys.